Well, hello and welcome live from our studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Thank you very much for tuning in. You are watching The Week Ahead. As always, you can interact with us on our various social media platforms at The Week Ahead or using the hashtag The Week Ahead. Well, I'm your host, Liesl Wilson. Let's get straight into it. Well, Eskom suspends its rolling blackouts due to an improvement in its generation capacity and lower demand during the weekend. In other news, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in South Africa as Washington, D.C. seeks to reset its engagement with the continent. And political campaigning closes in Kenya. This is ahead of the national general elections. Right, those will look at your headlines. Let's get into some of those stories now. First up, the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in South Africa on the first leg of his three-nation African tour. He is also expected to visit the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. Blinken is scheduled to deliver an important speech in South Africa tomorrow on U.S. strategy on sub-Saharan Africa, climate change, trade, health, and even food security will all be topics of discussion. This is Blinken's second trip to Africa, Secretary of State. It comes after visiting Nigeria, Senegal, and Kenya in November. Perhaps more on this, we are joined by SABC News reporter Kailihle Kumalo. A very good afternoon to you, Kai. Thanks for joining us. Perhaps you could walk us through some of the primary objectives that brings U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the country.
Well, undoubtedly, Liesl, is quite important because South Africa and the United States of America, they do have a strategic partnership. They collaborate in so many areas. You look at technology, look at education, people-to-people contact as well, and many other spheres as well. But most importantly, this is about them resetting, of course, their foreign policy in sub-Saharan Africa, especially after a very devastatingly sad time during the Trump administration, where, of course, a lot of things were said that were not in a very good light, so to speak. So it's quite a very pivotal time and a very significant moment for now the Biden administration to have such a relationship with Africa. In fact, during the course of his visit, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, will be launching a sub-Saharan strategy. And this is quite important because the United States of America does realize that other superpowers are right here in the continent. You look at the rise of China in Africa. You also look at the presence of the Russians as well. So it's quite a very important time for the Americans as well to amplify their presence in the continent. But of course, where we are positioned, Liesl, it's a very important point in terms of the history of South Africa. We're right in Soweto at the Hector Peterson Memorial. You know, there's quite a lot of rich history in terms of the resistance against the apartheid. And when you look at the United States, you know, in the 80s, they had that comprehensive anti-apartheid act that was really making a very just tough time for the apartheid regime. But also, you know, when I spoke to the American embassy, they said they chose this location because recently South Africa marked the Youth Month, where they were just celebrating right in our shores, the legacy and just the role that had been played by the young people in terms of achievement of democracy. But apart from that, Liesl, this comes at a very critical time as well, where the issue of security is very important. One of the issues that will be, you know, featuring prominently will be just around economic investment right here in South Africa. You do know that there are over 600 American companies that are right here in South Africa, but you have other trade instruments like AGOA, a beneficial in terms of trade, a preferential trade agreement between sub-Saharan Africa and the Americans. But of course, the Secretary of State is likely to arrive here right about 1:30.
Alicia, thank you very much for that update. You've spoken about amplifying their presence on the continent. And speaking of history, I wonder if you could briefly, explain South Africa's history in terms of relations with the U.S. You alluded to the Trump administration, perhaps also what unfolded there. How else have the administrations fared?
Lisa, whenever you talk about the United States and South Africa, and just given the position of South Africa in the continent, especially right in the southern region, South Africa is a gateway. Of course, over a period of time, there has been an array of challenges facing the country. And one of the areas of cooperation that the two leaders, once the Secretary of State, Blinken, is meeting with the International Relations and Cooperation Minister, Dr. Naledi Pandor, they'll be looking at so many spheres in terms of deepening their economic ties, socially, politically, and many other aspects as well. And what is very important about this relationship is that it should be mutually beneficial, because you look at during the campaign season when President Biden was still trying to push to get to the White House, one of the very clear commitment was that he really wants to work with this continent, making sure that there's mutual respect, there's cooperation. And we do know that during the course of the launch of that US Sub-Saharan Africa plan, there'll be a very clear emphasis that the African countries are of geostrategic in terms of their position, working around the issues of security. For example, when Mr. Blinken will be going to the DRC, that's another country that he's going to visit. We do know that between Rwanda and the DRC, there has been a destabilization with the rise of the M23. So he's going to support the peace and security around the Great Lakes region, so that that particular area that is very vital in terms of economic prowess of the continent is really strengthened. But also then heading to Rwanda, Liesl, where he will get an opportunity to talk about, once again, the issues of human rights. We do know that there's a gentleman by the name of Paul Rusesabagina. So he was arrested in Rwanda. He's a permanent U.S. resident. It's one of the issues that is going to feature. But there was a communique from Kigali that was very clear that he was incarcerated. They do believe that he's facing these terror charges. Of course, Washington, D.C. is disputing those claims.
Kumalo, SABC News reporter, thank you very much for that update. Just giving us the latest with regards to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken having arrived in South Africa on the first leg of his three-nation African tour. Of course, we'll be monitoring that as it unfolds. But moving on to other news now, the month of August in South Africa is dedicated to women. Back in 1956, 20,000 women staged a peaceful march to the Union buildings in protest against the extension of the pass laws. Now, South African women still face a myriad of challenges, such as gender-based violence, sexual harassment in the workplace, unemployment, and unequal pay. This year, President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to deliver the keynote address at this year's Women's Day celebrations to be held in KwaZulu-Natal. As we continue to highlight the plight of women in South Africa, transformation and women empowerment 28 years into democracy, Yolanda Kuba, founder of the Mentorship Boardroom and VP of MTN Southern and East Africa, joins us ahead of Women's Day commemorations. A very good afternoon to you, Yolanda. Thank you for joining us here on the SABC. Right, Yolanda, I think you're on mute. Perhaps you could unmute yourself.
Hi, and how are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation today. And I wonder if we could just start off by challenging the status quo overall. In your opinion, what are the realities of oppression and sexism historically? Perhaps how have they been perpetuated and maintained to date?
Yeah, I think, the first thing is the oppression of women starts with violence, right? And then it's perpetuated in language and in how we actually deem women. So if you think about it today, 40% of men actually beat up their partners, right? Just think about that for a second. That's almost 1 in 2 men are actually beating up their partners or have beaten up their partners in the lifetime of whatever relationship they have. 25% of men also have actually committed a sexual crime. That's 1 in 4 men. Again, just think about that for a second. The 4 men that you know, 10 men you know, if you know 4 men, 1 of them have actually committed a sexual crime. And then when we come to the work environment, you see, let's pick on the JSE, right? Right now, 28 years later into our democracy and transformation, we only have about 3 or 4 women in the top 40 who are CEOs of top 40 companies as we speak. The gender pay gap still exists. So women are generally, on average, paid somewhere between 20 and 40% less than men for the same job. So this systematic kind of oppression of women, and actually being quite, I don't know if it was deliberate at the beginning, but right now it's starting to feel quite deliberate. In fact, earlier this week, I actually made a point to a team of women to say, actually, there is a war on women out there.
Absolutely, Yolanda. It's actually tiring to be having the same conversations, and we look at the systemic issues of patriarchy and white supremacy, and we can't ignore how that's also perpetuated some of the lived reality that we as women experience. So I wonder, how do we begin to navigate the power structures that currently persist in society? How do we look at the role of men? How do we even counter these microaggressions and silences that support the status quo?
No, I think the first thing to do is actually, firstly, us as women, start taking a stand that says we will not tolerate any microaggression, any aggression in the language that gets used in the boardroom and in general society. The comments about it's as hard as maybe a woman giving birth, right? No man has the right to even say that, right? However, we allow it to happen. So how do we actually change the language? How do we actually ensure that men actually start treating women with the dignity that they deserve? Then go back to basic to our boy children and say, what should we be teaching our boy children to start off with? Because if we are not engaging the boy children in the conversation, we are not going to get the right outcomes. Having said all this, let's recognize that there are men that are trying to change the status quo. There are men in corporate boardrooms, in society, in civil society, that are saying we want representation of women. And how do we encourage those and empower those to have a bigger voice within the conversations? Right now, I just feel there's a lot of talk. However, the action is actually still weighing far behind.
Yeah, talk and political will. And, we're listening to some of the sentiments being echoed. And given the ratio of women to men in South Africa, I mean, if women decided to stop working or to stop showing up, this country would collapse. So it literally, I mean, so it will be interesting to see when we take that stand, what measures we put forth as well. And in terms of that, we also have to look at the issue of accountability. So in your opinion, what is the best way then to ensure accountability on the gender-based strategies that have been implemented, even in organizations? How can they ensure that their policies and practices generally meet the needs of female staff, particularly on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing to do is to ensure that we include women in the actual plans that are being developed by corporations and also by civil society in general. And secondly, when there are no consequences, unfortunately, for doing something that is bad, people do not actually do good, right? Or they selectively do good. So what we need to do, if you remember, there was a time you would walk into a restaurant and everyone was smoking. Today, we don't experience that. And why are we not experiencing that? It's not because we were not against people stopping to smoke. It's not because restaurants didn't say they're going to lose revenue. It's not because of all these other things. It's because there were real consequences that were enforced in order to ensure that that happens. What is that? That's called first political will. And then secondly, the systems to ensure compliance with those systems. And what was done there is that the compliance was placed solely, almost, or not solely, but almost at the feet of the restaurateur, the bar, the whatever, the company. They are the ones that would actually suffer consequences if they didn't comply with those laws. And all of a sudden, 10, 15 years later, you can't imagine a world in which everyone was smoking everywhere. Right? Yeah. So how can we bring that forth? How do we take that same political will, that same kind of zest that we had in order to implement that? Kicking and screaming, we implemented it. But today we have healthier lungs everywhere because we chose to actually implement that.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking to policy and change. And as we look at navigating the waters, charting the way forward, given the trajectory of the country, perhaps even our current reality, how would you explain ethical leadership? And as a leader in your own right, how do you stay mindful of who is at the table and who's missing, just to stop gender bias amongst some of the other issues that women continue to face?
So, I mean, I think from an ethical leadership perspective, we as South Africa have to have a social compact on what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. But as an individual as well, you actually have to say, what does that constitute for you? What does a right? What does equitable? What does inclusion versus exclusion or inadvertent exclusion actually mean? And for me, ethical leadership means actually going out there and being deliberate about equality across the board, being deliberate about inclusion across the board, whatever it means, even in areas where it makes me uncomfortable. Am I asking who is around the table? I made an example again 2 weeks ago about Mrs. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka when she was a minister at DME, the Minerals and Energy. I mean, she actually asked, where is Yolanda in a meeting? And then after that meeting, there was never a meeting where I wasn't included in a meeting that actually had to do with our business. So it is important that people that are also in power actually start demonstrating visibly by actually asking, where are the women around the table? Where are the women in the discussions that we need to have? If they're not doing that, if your HR director in the business is not ensuring that in the list of candidates, there's 50% representation of women, then we are not getting anywhere. So every time we recruit, I don't care who you recruit for, ask, where is the representation of women? Because if we're not doing that, then we are not going to get to the outcomes.
It seems we're just then decorating or rearranging the chairs on the decks of the Titanic, because it is a sinking ship if we don't change. Perhaps in conclusion, what goes through your mind when you think of women who've joined the workforce before you? And based on that, where do you think we are headed as a country?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about the women that went before us, I always think of the Wendy Luhabes and so on, especially for Black women for me, and Triposa Romanos and many others. And I just remember how militant they were around the issue of transformation, and especially about women being represented in every sphere. When I started work, it was around the early 2000s, right? And these were the women that actually had the voices. And I just feel like somehow we are starting to give up the grounds that they actually had gained. Because when I look around, in a lot of the transformational kind of spaces, I'm not seeing enough women in the room. And yet, when we look at qualifications in universities, when we look at qualifications, for example, I'm a CA, women's Black CA in particular, today we have 4,000. When I qualified, there was 100 and something of us. So, I'm still not seeing enough of them being represented. So, does it feel like we are regressing? Yes, it does. Is there still progress being made? Yes, it's baby step kind of progress. We should not be crawling at this stage. We actually should be running.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the struggle continues, Yolanda, and may these cries not fall on deaf ears. But thank you very much for your time here on the SABC today. Again, Yolanda Kuba is the founder of the Mentorship Boardroom, as well as VP of MTN Southern and East Africa, joining us ahead of Women's Day commemorations, where we continue to highlight the plight of women in South Africa and really focus on what transformation looks like, as well as women empowerment 28 years into democracy. Let's leave the conversation there, take a quick ad break, and continue with more news and updates on the other side. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The week ahead continues with myself, Liesl Wilson. We continue our Women's Month coverage. We shine a spotlight on women's health. This August, young women and girls aged between 15 and 24 years are the population group with the highest risk of HIV infection in South Africa. It's according to research on new HIV infections in the country. It comes almost also after that population group being the worst affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, including a rise in GBV and femicide cases. Dr. Veni Naidu, HIV Community Services Lead at Broadreach Health Development, joins us to discuss a little bit further. A very good afternoon to you, Dr. Veni. Thanks for joining us here on the SABC.
Thank you very much, Liesl, and good afternoon to you and to your viewers.
I mean, it's obviously concerning that we're having these conversations 28 years into democracy as we look at the risk factors associated with these alarming HIV prevalence stats in South Africa, which have been heightened by the reality of triple threats. I mean, walk us through what those risk factors are that make, young women between the ages of 15 and 24 among the most vulnerable to HIV infection.
Yes, they are. And, one of the main risk factors is peer pressure, having unprotected sex with an HIV positive partner, especially one with a very high HIV viral load that is detectable. There's also lack of resources in the communities, poverty, the need for financial security that put young girls at risk. There's also the unbalanced power relationships. We have the patriarchal culture, economic dependence. Those factors lend itself to submissive behaviors, leading to a lack of voice for the correct level of protection, to protect one's bodies. The other important study that has shown is that orphanhood in itself makes children vulnerable to HIV, and the lack of parental and family guidance are also contributory factors.
Well, speaking of those factors, then, when we look at the stigmas attached to HIV and AIDS, perhaps also the extent that, government's response to HIV and the facilitation of the rapid spread of this infection to date has contributed to that, how would you fare that statement?
Yes, we still have a lot of stigma and discrimination, but we need to normalize these conversations because we are living in the environment where HIV is very prevalent and more prevalent amongst young people. So we need to, have conversations not only with our peers, but also with our parents and other supportive structures that HIV does exist, and how do we prevent it, And there are solutions, there are prevention methods that one can take to prevent one's own body and to make South Africa an AIDS-free country.
So let's look at... Yeah, so let's look at those interventions and perhaps what is an offer to provide hope. What are some of the options available on both the medical and community-based intervention? I mean, prevention at the end of the day is always better than cure.
Absolutely. And so Broadreach Health Development, via the USAID-led DREAMS program, aims to empower young women to reduce HIV transmission and to live AIDS-free. So the targeted intervention that we have for adolescent and young girls, it involves PrEP. Now, PrEP is a pre-exposure prophylaxis to reduce the risk of HIV transmission. It is a combination therapy. And so when a young girl comes to the health facility, she will receive counseling on HIV prevention, sexual and reproductive health services, which includes family planning. She is screened for sexually transmitted infections and also issued with condoms. So the adolescent girls and young women are screened also for intimate partner violence, as you rightly pointed out. Since COVID, we are finding that partner violence has been on the increase, and we also found that teenage pregnancies are on the increase. And so the young girls really need to empower themselves and protect themselves by taking PrEP and also asking for PrEP at their health facilities. We have sensitized the healthcare workers as well to be very sensitive when young girls come to the clinic, to be non-judgmental and to listen to their case, to listen to their story, and to offer them the right clinical and non-clinical services. So in terms of non-clinical services that you asked me about, the DREAMS program starts with primary services that are offered in the community. And these are very comprehensive sexuality education that is offered at schools. So that is very school-based. And then, of course, in the community, there are programs and interventions that move towards social asset building to mentor and make the girls stronger. And also there are economic strengthening programs as part of the package, which helps young girls to on financial literacy and, also help them with employment opportunities in the future. So those are the non-clinical intervention of the DREAMS program. So combined with the clinical that we offer at the health facilities, we really help to empower young girls. And we really appreciate this opportunity to tell young women that there are services out there, there is hope. Please do come to the health facilities and seek care, because you really deserve it.
Dr. Naidu, it obviously, as you alluded to now, boils down to education, awareness, and, complementing this with supporting programs as well. And as we look at the future of South Africa, because, this age group obviously becomes the future labor force of the country, the future of the country. Maybe you could highlight the difference between rural and urban areas. What have you also picked up in terms of, prevalence in those instances? How have things improved or not improved on that front?
Yeah, so we are finding, the prevalence being high in both sectors, urban and rural, and a lot more actually in the urban areas, because of the mobility and and people moving. So because they move from the urban to the rural, especially during school holidays, that's where we find the transmission then increasing on the other side. And when the kids come back to the urban areas, for example, when they start going to tertiary education institutions, they would then take the PrEP. But when they go home, then they forget about the PrEP. And that's what really exposes them to being without their medication and therefore more vulnerable when they go home. So the high mobility between urban and rural makes it, high in both arees, makes it of concern in both sectors.
Well, then in conclusion, as we, speak and bring some of the programs and initiatives to the fore, we ultimately are not going to get anywhere if we don't address the systemic issues. We don't address the triple threats of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Perhaps also the power imbalances that you spoke about earlier within society and relationships in general. How do you begin to navigate and confront those issues as we imagine or reimagine the way forward?
Yeah, so really my plea to young women would be to empower yourself with this kind of information, and you have to almost take responsibility for your own health. Don't depend on anyone else. Look within, internalize your situation and seek help, because there is plenty of help and there is a support system. And we are so fortunate in South Africa that we have, the Department of Health, and we also have other partners like the Department of Social Development and the police that also assist with, providing services to young women. So we need to all collaborate together to make sure that we are seeking the right type of help to receive the right type of services,
Dr. Veni Naidu, thank you very much for your time. Dr. Veni Naidu is an HIV community service lead at Broadreach Health Development. Again, just chatting about women's health. This as we shine a spotlight on women's health in August. As we heard alarming stats, young women and girls aged between 15 and 24 are the population group with the highest risk of HIV infection in South Africa. So just addressing the risk factors and also charting the way forward as we reimagine a better future for all. Let's take another ad break. The week ahead continues on the other side. We'll be right back. Right, welcome back. The week ahead continues. Let's take you back to Soweto, where we find a reporter, Kailihle Kumalo. Kailihle, obviously live visuals coming through. It does look like the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived on the back of what we spoke about earlier. What currently is transpiring on your end?
Well, that's right, Liesel. So these are the visuals that you're seeing here from Hector Peterson Memorial right here in Soweto. So the Secretary of State from the U.S. just arrived in Soweto. So these are the visuals that you're going to see throughout. You can see that his motorcade is right here. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see. So it's going to be a very significant occasion because he's going to lay a wreath in honor of Hector Peterson, one of the youngsters who unfortunately died in those Soweto uprisings in 1976. And this is one of the locations that has been chosen by the U.S. Embassy to celebrate the youth of South Africa. And we do know that they are facing a myriad of challenges, and someone who's well positioned as well here is, of course, that's the sister of Hector Peterson, that Antoinette. So she's right here as well. But it's a very important moment as well between South Africa and the U.S. It's a day one for the Secretary of State in the country after quite a very busy schedule for him, Liesel. He just got back from Southeast Asia where he was attending the ASEAN summits in Cambodia. And now he's right here in Sub-Saharan Africa. So now it's the opportunity of Sub-Saharan Africa to have an opportunity to engage with the U.S. So any minutes from now onwards, he may come out. So we're just all waiting keenly. And obviously a very significant moment between Washington, D.C. and Pretoria. We do know that these are very important countries. They work together in so many spheres. You look at education, you look at technology, you look at issues around the fight against corruption. We know this is a very pervasive issue right here in the country. But also, I'm not alone, Liesel. We do have our own international editor as well, Sophie Mugwena. So, Sophie, quite a very poignant moment is, of course, the wreath-laying ceremony to honor Peter, of course, one of the young stars who fought against apartheid.
Yes, the story of Hector Peterson is quite huge and all over the world. You'd recall that those visuals were beamed all over the world, and therefore it is one issue that will continue to haunt those who were involved in the massacre of young people in South Africa in 1976. When I arrived here, when I looked at that picture, I was asking myself, who pulled that trigger that finally led to the fatal shooting of Hector Peterson and many other young students or learners in South Africa. I think it's a picture that will continue to be in our minds, and all the time high-profile diplomats visiting South Africa, visiting this place to really get a sense of what that picture meant then and even now, a conscious to young people in the country that the freedom that was achieved after 1994, it was not easy to achieve that. It was by sweat and blood of many South Africans in South Africa who fought for the liberation of this country. And Hector Peterson's sister standing there because the Secretary of State will lay the wreath there, and they will have a short discussion around this important area where we are today in Soweto. And I think, it is going to be a moment to reflect, particularly for the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken.
And it's quite fascinating because, well, there you go. So the moment you've all been waiting for, there you go. That's the 71st Secretary of State from the United States of America is walking here and is coming to, of course, to pay homage to the young man who perished here. And of course, very important moment, very poignant as well. Speaking to the history of South Africa, a very terrible, there you go, the very important handshake. That's, of course, the sister of Hector Peterson, that's Antoinette. There's interaction there, so we're expecting Mr. Blinken to lay a wreath in a matter of time. So We've been really waiting for this moment, and it's finally here, Sophie.
Yes, it's finally here. We have witnessed many Secretary of State from the United States of America since 1994 visiting South Africa. You can talk about Hillary Clinton, you can talk about Madeleine Albright, you can talk about many others who have touched down here in South Africa. And today, here we are, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has arrived. The first event of the day, he landed this morning. Another engagement later this afternoon, and of course the big one tomorrow with Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor.
And what does it mean just between Washington, D.C. and Pretoria that we're seeing this occasion? And of course, it's a very important period for these two countries, especially because these are the economies that were affected by COVID-19. And we also saw the U.S. coming to the rescue of sub-Saharan Africa at some point, albeit there was an issue of, the vaccine holding at some point. But what does it mean, just to unpack it?
It is important for South Africa to continuously have these engagements with other countries, not only the United States of America, with the aim of pushing the interest of the country. And that interest will include around ensuring that we have a peaceful Africa, we have a peaceful world, but also the issues of trade and investment, because it is important for South Africa to continuously have those healthy relationships. You spoke about the COVID-19. Yes, indeed. It was the United States of America that assisted South Africa in its fight against the TRIPS waiver, even though we didn't get exactly what we wanted. But the President of the United States of America, Joe Biden, did support President Ramaphosa and India in particular when they were pushing the World Trade Organization to consider the issue of TRIPS waiver for COVID-19 vaccines and all the therapeutics, while this challenge is still a pandemic.
So there you have it. It's a very momentous occasion. So now, of course, he has paid homage. Of course, the Secretary of State is joined by Hector Peterson's sister. There is a dialogue that they are having there, and one can just wonder what they are talking about. But I'm sure it's very just gory details about those events, how they were running. So, but I believe now they are proceeding inside the museum.
Yes, they are going to visit the museum, and inside the museum, that's where they will see more pictures in terms of what transpired on that fateful day where Hector Peterson lost his life, and many young people perishing.
And of course, just bear with us, the visuals might just be a bit wobbly as we are making our way inside the very historical sites, of course, paying tribute to those young people who really marched against the apartheid regime. And it is quite a very poignant time. Of course, it is a walkabout. It's bound to be just a bit clumsy, so just bear with us as we're having this walkabout inside here. And of course, a very interesting time. And it's been a very busy schedule for the Secretary of State. And we know that tomorrow he's going to have a very important time as well, where he's going to meet with the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Pandor, where they'll be looking at a number of issues in terms of cementing the bilateral ties between the United States of America and South Africa. So once again, just bear with us. It might be slightly dark in here as we just enter inside here, this historical site, the Hector Peterson Memorial right here in Soweto. And we're just going to wait kindly for the Secretary of State from the U.S., Anthony Blinken, as he makes his way inside this very sacred facility. And of course, I'm still not alone. We still do have our own international editor here, the SABC, Sophie Mukwena. And there you go, they're right inside. So I'm sure Antoinette is giving a very detailed account about those moments and in 1976. That was a very harsh period of time. Of course, you can see in our visual as well, there's an ambassador designate from Washington, D.C., and he's yet to give in his credentials. And of course, he's still ambassador designate. He must be accredited, and then we'll have an interaction with him. Of course, it's a bit of... All right. All right, so just bear with us. Obviously, very interesting times. Liesl, I can tell you this much. This is a very... Well, Sophie's still here. Sophie, let's talk about, as we enter here, quite a very important moment. So much, I'm sure, the history of this country.
Pushing and shoving, journalists trying to get the best visuals. I hope our viewers will bear with us with those shaky visuals. But indeed, an important moment as Hector Peterson's sister is kind of relating what transpired on that day. And in the museum, the pictures telling a story, a gory story of what transpired.
And I'm sure, I'm just looking at these visuals. The Secretary of State looks very fascinated by the history, but also just a very sad chapter about the road that South Africa has traveled. And, you look at South Africa and the US, how they've supported South Africa's journey in terms of its own democracy. Of course, not without weaknesses, with a number of strides made in so many respects, but also with quite a number of challenges that we still do face in the fight against corruption, in the fight against the youth unemployment, and a myriad of other challenges.
Yes, of course, the country going through difficult times right now. You know that in 2008, it was the economic meltdown globally. We were affected and then we recovered. Of course, COVID-19, with all the challenges and the impact thereof, particularly relating to the economy of South Africa. And from there, now you have this challenge of the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, because you know that globally the economy was affected or is still affected. And therefore, yes, the visit comes at a difficult time. You can see even the nation is restless because of the economic challenges that we are facing currently. And this visit is quite important in a sense that it will also speak to trade relations. How can South Africa strengthen trade relations with other countries so that the economic situation of this country can improve? And therefore, I think, it comes at a difficult time. It comes at a very, very difficult time. And I think for now, let's hand over to our colleagues in studio to continue with the program. I think we have reflected what is happening here at Soweto.
Very much so, Liesl. So we're just going to hand it back to you. Of course, it's been a bit of a wrestling ride, but of course, those are the moments that we'll leave you with from here in Soweto at the Hector Peterson Museum. So back to you in Johannesburg.
Very much, Sophie Mukwena, as well as Khalihle Kumalo at the Hector Peterson Memorial. That's in Soweto, where we understand that the U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has now arrived in South Africa, is on a tour at the museum. This forms part of the first of his three-nation African tour, expected to visit the DRC as well as Rwanda as well. We'll continue to monitor that visit, perhaps also look at some of the issues that come out. We're looking at the economy, we're looking at issues of food security, perhaps even drawing parallels between what is currently unfolding in the United States of America and South Africa, and how the countries are going to collaborate, work together to charter the way forward. So we'll continue to monitor as that unfolds. Let's leave it there, take a quick ad break. We've got more on the other side. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The week ahead continues. Now, further afield on the continent, campaigns have closed in Kenya. It's ahead of the general elections, where presidential frontrunners Raila Odinga and William Ruto pledged in their last rallies to accept the results of the tightly contested race as well as maintaining key peace. Kenyans go to the polls to elect a president, members of parliament and senate, as well as representatives to the county assemblies rather. Again, a very big story we'll be monitoring on the SABC. All this set to unfold on Tuesday. And in other news now, we're also taking a look at the newly appointed SACP General Secretary, Solly Mapaila. He's addressing the organization's 101-year celebration rally in Mpumalanga province. On that note, let's take you live there.
What Thomas Sankara did in Upper Volta when he created what we commonly call today Burkina Faso, he created the incorruptible nation, the upright people. That's what Burkina means. We also greet Comrade Dakim Buyani, our provincial chairperson, who's also part of program directing, and the entire leadership of our province of the Communist Party. Comrade Temba Mtembu, our provincial secretary from Moses Mabhida province or KwaZulu-Natal. Our district secretary, Comrade Malaji, who's doing quite well in this community as a leader of our party and our structures here in Mpumalanga, and all members of the SACP. The leadership of the ANC, led by Comrade Snuki Zigalala, also president of the ANC Veterans League, Commissar of Commissars, the People's Commissar, and the leadership of the ANC in the province, led by Comrade Speedy Mashilu, and the rest of the leadership, provincial secretary and members of the PSC, structures of the ANC, and all members of our movement present here. The leadership of COSATU, led by the fellow fighter, Mike Madala Shingange, the fighting shop steward. I must indicate, National Chair, that this shop steward is one of the most amazing shop stewards. He's forever on strike, leading one unit or section or the other of the working class, particularly as the first shop steward of Nehau, our fighting union. I recognize that, fellow fighter. Thank you very much for not leaving the trench lines, the front lines. Even during COVID-19, together with your entire leadership of Nehau, all of you, Comrade Zola is here, General Secretary, you were all affected by COVID-19 when we're in the front line, leading the frontline workers in these battles for people's power and people's health. I also recognize Comrade Soli Petwe, the Deputy General Secretary of COSATU, who's also a member of our Central Committee in his own right, as is Comrade Mike Shingange, who is also a member of our 15th Congress Central Committee. The same as Comrade Zola Sapeta, General Secretary of Nehau. I also recognize the General Secretary of SATU and the Treasurer General of SATU. The General Secretary of SATU, Comrade Mukwena Maleke, is also a member of our Central Committee. And all leaders of our trade unions in the province here, Comrade Thabo Mukwena, the Provincial Secretary of COSATU. All shop stewards and members of our federation and other unions, we recognize you. The Premier of our province, Mpumalanga, Premier Refilwe,
All those are live visuals coming through from Mpumalanga, the newly appointed SACP General Secretary Solly Mapaila, addressing the organization's 101-year celebration in Mpumalanga. Again, just echoing some of the milestones and sentiments regarding that big day. We're going to leave the conversations and analysis there. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Week Ahead. Do have a blessed week as well. We'll catch you next week for a look at the Week in Review. For myself, Liesl Wilson, and the rest of the team, until next time, do take care. It is goodbye for now.